Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm one of the principal security analysts here at SecurityMetrics. If you have been listening for a while, that you know we cover a lot of different topics. If you're brand new, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a huge back catalog of all kinds of topics. The topic today I'm very excited about because it speaks to one of the challenges that a lot of organizations run into, which is how do IT and the business side communicate together. It can be a super challenge on both sides. And the man I have today to talk to me about it has a lot of experience in this area. His name is Grant Elliott. Grant is the CEO and co-founder of Ostendio, a people-first risk management platform. Ostendio works with hundreds of companies and thousands of users to build security programs that are always audit-ready for complex audits such as SOC 2, HITRUST, FedRAMP, and HIPAA. He's a thought leader in enterprise cybersecurity and speaks regularly about how organizations can implement effective cybersecurity programs. Elliott is the former COO and CISO of Voxiva, acquired by Welltalk, an integrated messaging and patient engagement platform, and a former business executive at AT&T. He has more than 20 years of experience developing and managing cybersecurity programs and supporting regulatory audits. He is also an adjunct professor at the Pratt Institute New York, where he teaches management theory and leadership. Thank you for joining me and welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I'll bet someone else wrote that for you. Did I miss anything important?
No, it's all good. Yeah, it's been a while. It's a bit of a mouthful, I'm sure.
So the topic is, and anybody who has been either in IT or in senior management is, we have these security needs that have to be addressed, and then we have money that needs to be managed, people, time, the organizational resources that need to be managed. And yet the conversations between these two groups of people can be a super big struggle. How do we quantify security and compliance in ways that allows our C-suite to take it in? So I know that is a great, big, vast question I just asked you, but give it a shot.
Sure. I mean, look, there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of kind of, historical reasons why we can have this kind of difficulty to communicate. A big part, one of the things I talk a lot about is this concept of operational security versus technical security. And part of the challenge here is that if we kind of look at historically how we go about managing our information security programs, typically most organizations have a technical side and they have a kind of operational management side. The technical side builds out the tech, builds out the equipment, builds out the infrastructure. And we tend to think of security as being some sort of technical incident or technical. And probably 20 years ago, that was maybe true.
Mm-hmm.
Today, when we think about how organizations operationalize themselves, most data is in the cloud. There's not as much need for sophisticated technical management within our organization. But we still recruit our CISOs from the technical side of the house. We still tend to look, when we look for a security resolution, we look at our technical folks to do this. And we promote our technical folks up to the information security officer or our chief information security officer. And the thing about technical folks is they're obviously super smart and they understand technology, but they tend to look for technical solutions to the problem, regardless of what the problem actually is. And what we've evolved to today is that, close to 80% of security incidents are actually procedural rather than technical. People aren't physically hacking your AWS environment today, right? The way that they might have been brute forcing something before. And they're using things like social engineering. They're using things like phishing scams. They're using things like, lax password, right? And maintenance. There's a lot of operational things that people are taking advantage of today, operational lapses. Which is where most security violations actually occur. Yet we still think we can solve all those problems by just implementing more and greater technology. And I think that's where some of the disconnect comes into, you've got an operational leadership team looking and measuring things around ROI, looking around things about profitability. And then you get a technical team who are looking at things like, what's the coolest tool that can implement to try and automate or integrate a solution here. And it's very difficult for the both of them to kind of talk in the same language.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that I find interesting is that often we still put tasks on our technical folks that they are not trained or equipped to do, like a risk analysis of the organization. So they might have insight into some of the risks related specifically to technology, but the entire risk process is often put on technical teams. Have you seen that?
All the time. I mean, I think, again, it comes to this kind of default perspective that, the technology team are the ones that kind of manage security. And I don't know if you ever heard of the concept of the Peter Principle, right? And this is not meant to be disparaging of technical people, but I think that we see that in organizations all the time. You take someone who's really good at their job, right? And you promote them because, hey, you're so good at your job, we're going to promote you, put you into another job.
Yeah.
And maybe they're good at that job as well, right? So if they're really good at that job, then we promote them again. You're really good at that job, right? And we keep doing that until they're no longer good at their job, right? Until we basically promote them to a level where they can't do that job anymore. And then we keep them there, right? So we leave.
And they might not even enjoy that.
Exactly.
I talked to a lot of technical people who the only reason that they took the promotion was because there was also a raise attached to it.
Exactly. We do that a lot, especially with technical people, with IT folks who basically really enjoy. I've got a good friend of mine who spent many years, originally coding and built a really successful management career. He's now in his 50s and he's taken another job now. He's just back coding again. And he enjoys it immensely. It's kind of his first love in what we do. So we tend to take people with these kind of really, really great technical skills who are really talented at what they do. And then we put them into management. We put them into leadership. And that's not to say that technical people can't perform those roles. Absolutely, many, many can. But it's a different skill set, and we don't retrain them, right? We don't train them about business language. We don't train them about management. We just assume because they're smart technologists that they can somehow adapt. And then we have this other, as I said, it's the whole Mars and Venus thing. We have this other executive group, people that typically risen up through a different management track, right? Who are more business operational focused. And they typically tend to be the ones that end up becoming the chief operations officer, the CEO, they join boards. And somehow these two individuals have to find a common language, and that's very, very difficult to do. Look, security on its own is very difficult to talk about because there is no end game, right? Security is it's something that you have to do and continually evolve. You've got threats and you've got ways to try and defend against those threats. But business leaders need to have some sort of ROI. They need to have some sort of understanding or quantification, right? And let me describe how a typical business case review will go with the CISO of an organization and the executive team. The CISO will be pitched a really, really nice new technology that's recently on the market that someone sold and was basically going to cure world peace, hunger, and everything, right? It's going to solve it. They obviously know that, but they really like it's cool tech. And then they go in and it's like $2 million or it's $3 million, and they put that into their budget review for that year. And the executive team or the management, the CFO, looks at that and says, okay, what does that do for me? What's going to solve all these issues? Now, when they say it's going to solve these issues, the CFO or the management team don't know the universe that you're talking about. They just know, hey, that sounds like good. It's going to solve these issues. They don't know if that's one issue of 100 or 99 issues of 100, right? They don't understand the universe. But they understand it's expensive. And so then they make the CISO make all these promises. Well, if it's going to do this, it must be really good. Is it going to make us, is it going to take away all our risk? Well, not all of it, a lot of it. Okay, right, we'll invest in it because there's a huge amount, and you spend all this money from a budgeting perspective. Now, the problem with that situation is the CISOs typically had to invest too much time and effort to persuade the higher-ups that this is a valuable expenditure to make. The higher-ups think it's going to do more than it actually does. And so when inevitably they have some sort of security incident in a different part of the business with a different area, the executives look at the CISO and say, well, what you're doing, you promised us that everything was going to be good. And the CISO is going, well, no, but that was just for this part of the business, and there's been a disconnect there. So the CISO gets fired, right? And so they're really talking very different things. And, you mentioned it earlier on, we need to look at, the conversation needs to be about holistic risk across the business. And there has to be a common acceptance both at the executive level and at the security level. You're never going to eradicate risk. It's all about what is your risk appetite. It's about understanding how you quantify risk and then having a conversation about, okay, if I invest this amount over here, what is the net return from a reduction in risk I'm going to get? And is that enough? And it never is. But then there has to be an acceptance on both sides of the house that you're accepting risk. So that when something ultimately does happen, both sides of the house ultimately feel responsibility for it. Maybe it still results in the CISO being fired, I don't know, right? But at least the CISO has a more defensible argument to say, look, I didn't say I was going to eradicate 100% of risk. I just told you there's a really good tool and it's maybe going to eradicate 5% of risk.
Right. And so this is a conversation I have almost every week with people, because there will be some super on fire IT or security guy, which are great. You want these people in your organization, but saying, I've been raising the red flag. This is a problem, and nobody's listening, and I can't get the budget for this. And my answer typically is, all right, how are you presenting an understanding of the risks that you believe need to be addressed right now? And second is, you need to know that you are not the one responsible for making the decision. You're responsible for presenting the issue. You're also probably responsible for coming up with more than one answer that could serve. So is it a tool? Is it people? Is it a change of processes? But you need to be able to present different options. And then there are other people whose job it is to be responsible for the decision that is made. And so those conversations on who quantifies the risk and then who makes the decision on the risk, a lot of it comes down to, they're siloed when they actually come up with the risk register in the first place. So here they are. Okay, who's coming up with the risks? Well, who are the people in the room? And have the conversations happened that help level set what the risk really is. A lot of times that isn't happening when there is that vast disconnect in between the people who believe there's a huge risk and the people who are maybe going to come up with the funds to address the risk. This episode is brought to you by our SecurityMetrics penetration testing team. They do a lot of pen tests. They do a lot, like network layer, application layer, segmentation checks. They're very, very knowledgeable, and some of them have even won like competitions at DEF CON. So you can rely on these guys to know what they're doing. Head over to SecurityMetrics.com, learn more about pen testing.
Yeah, look, risk management is super hard, right?
Yeah.
And I think, let's get that out there, right? I would probably say out of most of the organizations I speak to, 2 or 3% of them effectively do risk management. Probably 80% of them do risk assessment in some sort of form, and we'll talk about whether they do that well or not. But the vast majority of organizations I speak to do risk assessment; they don't do risk management. And what I mean by that is that we can assess risk. I'll be amazed how oftentimes I'll see an IT department build out a risk register, which is a list of assets, and then they try and have a list of risks against those assets. Well, I don't know how you can even assign a risk to an asset, right? An asset is just a thing, right?
Exactly.
Risk. What is the impact that asset's going to have, right? So, we have to assess risk to scenarios more than asset to the scenarios. And then, risk itself is not just a single thing. You have to look at what is the impact if something goes wrong, balanced against the likelihood of something going wrong, right? So, let's take something really obvious, right? If we think about the risk of a natural event like an earthquake. Clearly, if you have an earthquake in an environment, it can be devastating to your organization, right?
Yeah.
But if you're living in Virginia like I do, the risk of an earthquake or a category 5 is pretty low, right? Yeah. And so how much time and investment should I be investing on securing my infrastructure, securing my facilities, securing my backup specifically for that risk? Because sure, the impact can be catastrophic, but the likelihood is super, super, super low, right? Different if I'm living in California or if I'm living somewhere that's prone, then I might have a slightly different calculus and I might want to decide to invest a little bit more. And then you start looking at the mitigations. Now that's just one environment, right? Or one scenario. But then I have to spread that scenario across the rest of my people, the rest of my assets, the rest of my finances, the rest of my business. And all of a sudden you start seeing that, like, when you look at a typical organization that probably has thousands of assets, hundreds, if not thousands of people, and all the different scenarios we talk about in terms of environmental impacts, physical impacts, security or cyber impacts, you suddenly realize that any organization is actually dealing with tens of thousands, maybe not hundreds of thousands of risk scenarios in order to do this properly. You can't do this by simply giving you a list of your assets and trying to have a single right. Now that's hard. You can't do it. You need a tool. You need some sort of platform, some sort of capability to basically do this properly and assign it. But then ultimately what you can do is you can start getting to an aggregate risk view that gives you data that allows both sides of the fence to start talking, okay, what does this data mean? How do we interrogate this data more? And how do we go about what are the ways that we can build risk mitigations in to try and look at where we have the biggest risk areas. And it's a constant evolution and a constant review. And you notice I've not once talked about some form of cyber tool, some form of malware device. They're all just mitigations. They're all potential mitigations that maybe go towards mitigating some form of risk, rather than, hey, I've just bought this tool because this tool is going to do X. This tool has to apply some sort of value to your risk mitigation strategy.
Right. And so I think that's why it's so important not to limit risk, the whole concept of that risk assessment to your IT team, because that's when you get that asset-based risk response, instead of having the risk scenarios that come up from the larger conversation. And so having that balanced conversation from the business and technical side of the house, I think, is where you really get the value in that risk assessment.
Yeah, no, completely. And especially when you bear in mind, as you said, right, obviously you have a big component of what you're doing in terms of IT risk, but you've got social risk, you've got environmental risk, you've got all sort of different risks in the organization, what may or may not be more impactful to your business. The challenge we have today as well is that, we've evolved quite significantly from an environment where you used to have this castle and moat sort of protection mentality. We could secure our data because we kept it inside the perimeter, and as long as we secured the perimeter effectively, then we could theoretically secure the data, keep the bad guys out, and and we're good. And then make sure that the people inside the castle, right, are again trusted people that are within the site. Well, guess what's happened in the last few years, right? With the advent of the cloud, the vast majority of the data is not within our castle, right? We're using all these third-party cloud tools. We host it in AWS or Azure, right? We use these third-party collaboration tools. The finance package we use is a cloud-based package, right? Our data is literally everywhere, and the vast majority of it is, even if we have a lot of it, is either duplicated or stored elsewhere. Well, so the next evolution of protection was, well, we know where our people are, so let's secure it based on where our people, let's secure access, right? So we go to access control, right? Well, guess what? Since COVID, we don't even know where our people are.
Exactly.
Right? All over the place, right? So we can't even geolocate or geo-source, right, in many of the ways to basically secure our people as well. So the only way that we can start thinking about how we protect data is to basically to actually think about data itself, right? Where is the data? Who has access to the data? And how do you protect the data from that perspective? And then not all data is equal, right? There's certain data that protect way more than other data, so you have to weight that data as well. And that whole comes into the whole concept. So you start realizing, again, the entire language I'm using here, none of it's technical, none of it's the software development, none of it's tools and technology. It's all just organizing a business problem.
Right.
And that's what business people do really, really well. And it's not to say that technical people can't do that, but I can tell you right now, the answer for any technologies is going to be, there has to be a tool that does that. And the tool that does that. And the reality is, tools and technology can definitely help you, but they're themselves not going to be the single solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on something you said earlier struck me, which was the security is an ongoing thing. It's not just a single thing. But sometimes we want to wrap it up in a package and go, look, I did this thing. You can't fire me because I proved that we were good. And so people will often use compliance in that way. And I'm not saying compliance is a bad thing. I think compliance can really help lift security because it creates those conversations and helps people look at the different layers of defense that are related to whatever that compliance is geared towards protecting, whether it's a specific type of data or whether it's systems themselves. But just doing a one and done compliance, that's not the way to go. You've got to look at, like you were saying, what are the operational processes that support security? But how do you think maybe compliance can fit into that?
So I think the problem for me is that people think about compliance the wrong way, right? Compliance, security can exist without compliance. Compliance can't exist without security, right? And what I mean by that is that the whole point of compliance, right, is you're trying to determine, is an organization operating against a particular security standard, right? And there's lots of standards out there, right?
There sure.
to me, I regularly advise, it's less important what standard you pick and whether you pick a standard, right?
Yeah.
And the standard you're probably going to pick is not going to be defined by you. It's going to be defined by your clients or your customers or whoever. They're going to tell you what standard they want you to use. Being compliant is just you basically taking a point in time measure that says, yeah, I'm operating against the standard that we've determined is the standard that we want to measure ourselves against. But compliance somehow has evolved to its own thing. It's almost evolved to be like, hey, compliance is this thing. Compliance is basically doesn't exist without the security standard.
Absolutely.
Well. I think that's also evolved in the industry just now. You see a lot of organizations out today offering automated compliance, for example, right? And I kind of think that's like an oxymoron in terms of the fact that the whole point of compliance is to verify that a lot of your technology and a lot of your processes are doing what they say you do.
Right.
You can't automate compliance. You're just creating another point of failure
when
you automate. It's not you can't use tools to automate collection of data and collection of evidence and simplify. But this whole concept about putting compliance on autopilot is just ridiculous. Anyone who kind of buys into that really is kind of showing their kind of immaturity in terms of the kind of security journey they're actually on. And so the idea is, by all means, I think it's really important that organizations seek some sort of third-party independent review of their security program, because I do enough independent assessments of organizations, and people want to be correct, right? People that self-certify are always going to give themselves.
They're always going to get all the answers right. Yep.
And you talk to any auditor, a big part of their conversation with the clients always is the client says to them, well, really, I really need to do that much? And the auditor goes, yeah, that's the standard that you've signed up to. There's a reason why you need to do it to this extent, right? We talk a lot about the whole concept of what really compliance is, and different standards have a more specific or explicit determination depending on the standard itself. But for the most part, it's about basically saying what you do and then doing what you say, right? That's the whole concept of what you're trying to do.
Yep.
And what happens with a lot of organizations, and what happens especially with a lot of technologists or IT folks, is they've been trained from an early age that, look, I know I need to encrypt my database, right? I know that I need to probably have some sort of endpoint protection. I know that I have to have malware protection. They kind of come in with this kind of default perspective of things they need to do that they've heard or someone's telling them they have to do, and they go and build all these technologies. But step one actually has to be, you have to write down what it is you're intending to do, right? When you decide to use AWS as your hosting environment, what you don't realize is, without even thinking about it, you're already predetermining a whole bunch of policies that you're writing down here without even really thinking about it. You're realizing it probably needs to be physically secure. It needs to be safe from fire and water. It needs to present physical access. It needs to be have continual uptime. You sort of know that AWS is going to give you all those things, right? And so you're intuitively just making that decision, but you're not writing it down. And what an auditor wants you to do is to say, well, why did you choose AWS? Well, because I want 99.99% uptime, right? I want to make sure I get fire and forever. You have to just determine, write those things down. And then when the auditor comes in, he says, okay, let me look at your production hosting environment. Does it do all these things? Is it fireproof protection, whatever? It does, great. Now you've met that standard simply by the moment you chose to go with AWS, but you haven't written down the reason or the rationale why you've done it. And that's kind of where a lot of organizations end up failing their security audit.
Yes, and I've seen that. I just before I got on this call with you, I got off of a call with a team of IT and security guys who were kind of sour on the whole concept of PCI, which of course is the credit card security standard, and they wanted some assistance in making sure that they were using the right compliance report. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about your scope, and that's all determined by how data flows in your systems. Suddenly they started getting interested in it, because I said, I'm not even going to talk to you about the compliance standard until we first start talking about, do you know where information is? Do you know your systems? And do you know how you're securing them? Because if you're not secure, we're not even going to start talking about the compliance standard. And when they realized, oh, this is about security, which they were interested in, and the compliance was just demonstrating that, it turned around the entire conversation into an interesting puzzle rather than some checkboxes that they had to check off. And it wasn't making sense to them originally, because someone had told them, you need to assess against this this set of questions when that wasn't even the scope that they had. So of course there's going to be frustrations if you don't take into account what's the underlying purpose of whatever compliance or regulatory standard we're looking at. If you don't know why it was created in the first place, it makes it very hard to compare it against the security program that you have in place and understand how to speak to the compliance standard. That there's a lot of guys out there who are doing great, and girls, guys, general people who are doing really great work in the security space, who once they understand the purpose of the compliance that they're trying to attest against, then they start getting interested in it, because then they can show off, look at the good work that I'm doing, and really bring value to the efforts that are already in place, and just demonstrating that, proving that they're doing it using that compliance.
Yeah, and when I've given this talk a few times about operational versus technical security, sometimes I've been accused of beating up on the technical folks. And actually, I think, to your point, it's exactly the opposite, right? This is a way to demonstrate the value of what they do and the value of the protections they provide, right? Yeah. A lot of our customers tend to be kind of technology cloud providers, right? A lot of those organizations, as I mentioned earlier on, have a lot of data they have to protect. And you'll have a conversation with their team, and they get very defensive, right? And rightly so, because they've built probably a really good tech stack, right? They've done a lot of the things the right way, as I said, because I think, most people go through college, most people are trained in this issue. Technical security is built into a lot of the training, so they know natively what they need to do. The challenge is that when you look at compliance is about, say what you do and then do what you say. 80 to 85% of a compliance audit is administrative, right? I mean, It's not about coming in and assessing, right? There's things like pen tests and stuff like that are going to assess the technical capability of your environment. But most of your audit is basically, have you documented the rationale and the reasons for why you do things? Have you defined things like how are you giving access? How are you doing change control? All of these things are all procedural. Mm-hmm. And that's always the kind of part that kind of really shocks people. It's like they think, well, I can just go and buy a technology tool. Again, go back to these, automated compliance tools. They're still not providing that procedural. And, I came to this because, in my previous organization, I was both the chief operations officer and the chief information security officer. I wasn't the the CTO in the CISA. I was the chief operations. I've always been very operational in the way I look at things. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking for a way to implement an operational security program. And even our platform that we have in my company, even though we get labeled into this kind of GRC space, governance system, we always say we're not actually really a GRC. The problem with GRC tools is they're these kind of like inefficient tools that sit on the side of your organization that people have to spend extra hours updating or feeding information to. And they're kind of really glorified reporting repositories, right? What I was interested in building was a security operations platform, a platform that's used every single day by people across the organization, so that the data that you're collecting and managing is actually real-time ongoing data. And as we build this out and we use this platform as a security management platform, the great thing is we're just naturally creating this amazing byproduct called compliance data, mm-hmm. which is all the evidence that, you are responding to those tickets, you are managing that change control, you are onboarding that individual or offboarding that individual correctly, people are taking training, right? All the things that you have to demonstrate you do, as I keep going back to this, say what you do, then do what you say. We help these organizations build out the say what you do, and then our platform helps them track that they're actually doing what they say, which is the element, the whole concept of compliance is to make sure that people are operating the way they're supposed to be operating.
So that is, I think, a really good summary of how to put operational aspects of security first, and it brings to mind. So I was on an audit the other day where I had to look at onboarding and offboarding, what that process was, and the IT team talked to them about it, and they were kind of bored by the question, because they're like, well, we put them into this access management program, and this is how we sign them up, and this is how we take them out. Okay, well, how do you know that you're supposed to put them in there? And how do you know that you're supposed to take them out? And then when I got the HR team on the phone, I said to them, How do you get verification that they have put these people in properly? And how do you get verification that they have taken them out again? What's the communication there? So that process of communication, they had not even considered that was part of a really, actually, probably the most important part of how you manage access in an organization.
This is a great example of everything we're talking about. Exactly that. So an organization has one login, or they have Okta, they have one of these kind of access management tools. And I've asked people this before: do you really want Fred, right, who's your engineer who manages your Okta environment, being the one who's making the decisions over what level of access privilege everyone within the organization is going to have? Right? No. Well, how do you let them? Well, we create a ticket in Jira, right? And it goes to Fred, and it basically outlines in some sort of format all these different things. Okay, so now Fred has to basically make sure that all these different things. So that means you now want your HR director to be the one who's saying who is responsible for everything within. Well, no, the HR director doesn't know who should have access to the CRM or who should have access to the production data. So how do you? So right now, that's the only two people that are involved in the onboarding, right? So how does the manager get involved in that? And you think this is complex when you're actually onboarding someone, right? The great thing about onboarding is when something goes wrong, you get a new, really enthusiastic employee putting their hand up and basically saying, I don't have access to X, I don't have access to Y. And of course, their manager jumping up and down why there wasn't provision. But when that employee leaves, there's no one putting their hand up, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not just a question about basically having that process that allows you to track and manage, right, the onboard process with appropriate approvals and the appropriate authority. Now you have to offboard that user. How many times does it happen in an organization? They can't even remember what systems. Just removing them from their SSO capability. People think that just because they switch off Okta. Well, how many systems actually sit outside of Okta?
Yeah.
Right? Because not everything sits. And even if you just remove them without, you've not actually removed them from the core system, right? So you're going to have to you're still paying for a user account within your CRM system. Just because you switched off access to the Okta doesn't mean to say, and look, there's a lot of these tools today as well that whilst you can control some level of access through your SSO, there's still backdoor user ID password access. And so when that individual leaves the organization, when I left the previous organization before, there's a cloud-based tool called DNS Made Easy. And DNS Made Easy, for those out there that don't know, is a tool that basically manages all your domains within an organization. So all your .coms, all your .nets, etc., within your entire environment. So it literally controls access to every single system that you have within the organization. When I left, they did not switch off my admin access to that for 2 years.
Oh my goodness.
I could have literally logged in if I chose to at any point I wanted and had a lot of fun, right?
You could have taken them down. Yeah.
And traffic, right, to these different things. And so it shows you just how important it really is. There's cases and cases and cases of ex-employees that leave an organization who are then able to do something. Because oftentimes employees aren't always leaving in the best grace, right?
That's right.
And so sometimes motivated. And as I say to some people, if you have an employee that works for you and you've trained them effectively, you've given them policies and procedures, you've told them what the job is, and they make a decision, for example, to just go and take all your production data and dump it on the web, sure, you're going to be liable on the hook for some degree, but it's mitigated by the fact you can demonstrate, look, they knew they weren't supposed to do it. They had access for their job, they were trained. This is just a disgruntled employee that's behaving in a way that's unreasonable. And that will form some level of defense within a court of law, within the regulators. And so as long as before the Friday afternoon you sack them, that's when they do it, you get some defense. They do that on the Monday morning after you fire them and walk them off site on the Friday.
Yeah.
It's all on you.
Exactly.
Right? It's all on you. And again, I want to just point out, as we keep saying, none of this is technical.
Yeah.
This
is
all
operational.
And it's about trying to manage those operational workflows, those automated. The other one that I love is the background check one, right? So that you see some of these tools today that talk about doing automated background checks. Now, to this day, I never understand what automated background check is, because if you've used these background check companies, you realize how frustrating it can be, because they're only going to call an employer up 3 times before they basically give up. They're only going to call an education establishment 3 times before they give up, right? So whenever you do any of these background checks within these third-party organizations, not only are you supposed to define, how many employers, how many educational establishments, how many certifications, how far back, all this sort of stuff. You have to define this in your policy, what you're supposed to need. does this employee have to have the background check complete before they start or after they start, before they've accessed the sensitive data, after, right? All of these things are things you have to define as a policy within your organization. None of that's the background check company, that's just to do with your policy. And then you basically give it to the background check company, and as I said, they have all these issues. And no background check, in my mind, ever comes back clean. There might not be issues, but someone can't be contacted, some telephone number's wrong, right? How do you simplify that down to a checkbox? Right? And you look at some of these automating tools out there that claim, hey, we automate the background check for you. We'll give you, as part of your compliance project. And you look at it, it's a checkbox. And they're trying to say binary, a background check was done or a background check wasn't. It's just not that simple, right? So, you can't, it's very difficult to try and minimize this down to technology or to a tool or to an IT solution. This is about a combination of tools, but again, 80%, 85% process and only 15% technology.
Right. And kind of along the same topic of access, where you said, well, when does the manager get involved? Who decides what level of access? That's, I think, where a lot of value comes in, those conversations internally. Here's a role. What is this role supposed to access? And who decides that? Let's talk about what are the operational needs that create these operational accesses. And that's not something that I often see, that level of thought put into it. Another thing that I ask is if somebody set up an account with elevated privileges, let's say you have somebody who's an admin who can set up another admin, and he does, and who knows that this new account got set up?
Yeah.
Like what happens then?
So again, the way our platform handles that right now is not just the onboarding, offboarding, but we create a cadence. You get to set up a cadence that allows you to do what we call data access audits, right? So the order of the system, depending on the severity level of the technology or whatever data is managing, every month, every quarter has to go in and review, right?
Yeah.
So our platform show you exactly who's supposed to have access, and they can review that with who actually has access to that exact point, because things change all the time. The other thing that changes, I think that's really interesting is, as you mature or as you grow or as you change as an organization, things are dynamically changing at that point as well, right? So for example, we say to a lot of smaller organizations, to your point about access, if you're an organization of 10 people, as long as you write in your policy that all 10 people need admin access because of the nature of the job, you're a small organization, you get away with that, right? You can probably get away with all 10 people in the organization saying they need access to that. When you're a 1,000-person organization, you can't do that.
No,
right? You can't say 1,000 people. So now you start getting down to this concept, okay, right, what job roles, what job titles, what levels, etc. You have to start getting far more granular about access level, access rights, and access privileges. And you have to define that in order. And again, this is all process, this is all procedure. The technology is what you switch on and off based on the policy and procedure, and the technology makes a lot of these things a lot easier than they ever have. But you still have to have a policy and procedure. The simplest one I like to give in this one, just in terms of the way technology has evolved, is like laptops, right? I'm old enough to remember 10, 15 years ago, if you had sensitive data on a laptop, you had to implement a third-party encryption capability on the platform. Right? You had to buy it. Microsoft sold it. It wasn't cheap. Right. You pay on a per device perspective. Every laptop today comes automatically with encryption. You don't even have to do it. You just have to make sure it's switched on and you get someone managing it. So technology has made things easier and easier. And it's not that necessarily technology is not important. It's just that the tools and capabilities of technology have shrunk the impact, right? The percentage of your overall program, to the point now that most of your challenges today are managing the technologies and procedure and administrative. And to the beginning thesis of the conversation, this is why the conversation gets broken between the executives and the IT organization, because the IT organization are always talking about tools, always talking about technology, always talking about third-party devices. They're not talking about process. Right. And that we have to start setting targets around, we're going to use this framework that we're going to measure ourselves. We have to have this percentage of uptime and availability, right? We have to have this percent of data loss. You have to set these procedural targets from an operational perspective. And that's kind of the lesson of the evolution that the IT manager has to make. So for groups that currently have that fracture that we were talking about from the beginning,
Is that where you would have them start, is looking at what are their operational targets? Where would you have people begin who currently don't have good communication between technology and the operational side of the house, where cybersecurity is not integrated with operations?
So I think you have to teach your IT people to be more operational. You have to kind of find the ones that are, right? To the point at the beginning, who wants to be, right? Don't take Peter, who really just loves coding, and then make him in charge of everyone because he's a good coder, right? Good coders don't necessarily make good managers, right? It's not to say that they don't, right? But, being good at coding doesn't automatically. So you have to train your staff, right? You have to train them in management. You have to train them in the ability to do things like ROI. You have to train them on the importance of processes. So that's that's the kind of evolution that they have to make. Or what you can do is you can actually put, instead of basically putting your CTO in charge of the security program, put your chief operations officer in charge of your security program, right? And have a matrix manage the CTO from that perspective as well. Put operational people in charge of an operational problem, right? That's really, and I think the executive team have to think of security as an operational challenge, not a technical challenge. Technology is part of it, right? It's not all of it. They have to think about security and risk management as being operational in nature and not technical in nature.
I think I might steal that phrase, put operational people in charge of operational problems. Love it. That is excellent advice. And I really appreciated the conversation today. If people want to learn more about this idea or connect with you, where's the best place for them to go?
Sure. So they can go to our website, which is ostendio.com. That's ostendio.com. Or feel free to email me. I'm grant@ostendio.com.
Great. Thanks, Grant. Good to talk to you.
You too as well. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.